Hello. Welcome once again to Denton's Tales, where we now continue our look at the actual historical facts of the so-called Viking Age, which often differ very considerably from popular belief and the cinematic interpretations trotted out by Hollywood and TV shows, where both storylines and costumes, well, sometimes have very, very little to do with anything connected with the Old Norse, except in the rather addled minds of directors and costume producers. Basic facts, I suppose one could say, that the Old Norse were the greatest explorers, traders, merchants, settlers, and seafarers of their age. Indeed, the greatest till the so-called Age of Discovery many centuries later. And, of course, they were excellent craftsmen, woodworkers, jewellers, as well, of course, as superb shipbuilders. In fact, the longship being perhaps the finest ship ever devised for its intended purpose. Indeed, it is entirely due to the longship that we have ever heard of the Vikings, you see, since, well, without it, there would have been no Vikings to hear of. They were the product of their amazing ships, and without those ships, well, they would never have ventured beyond Scandinavia. And the Vikings, in the sense that we use that word now, well, they've never existed. We've never heard of them. They had raided prior to the Viking Age in what's termed the Vendel era, but those raids, they weren't extensive, and they occurred out off to the east, raids into nearby and easily accessible lands around the Baltic that they could, well, basically walk to or just hug the coast in small boats that weren't really capable of going out to sea. But it was the coming of the wonderful longship and the equally impressive cargo vessels called Knorrs that sent the raiders and the traders out to the west, to the south, into the Mediterranean Sea and beyond across the Atlantic. The new shipbuilding technology itself producing the Vikings, you see. The ships required for long sea voyages, now they may have been available anything up to 100 years sooner than we previously thought, given the quite recent discovery of two seagoing vessels on an island in the Baltic Sea. But those ships also seem to have confined their activities to the Baltic, despite being able to sail much further out into the open sea. But they didn't. They still, more or less hugged coastal areas. Now, to get on with the myth dispelling, the Shieldmaidens, or Skjaldmaerja, or plural, or Skjaldmaerja singular, are another misconception, at least in the way they are depicted in the TV series Vikings, which doesn't really get very much right, one has to say. Where, there are regiments of them. Yes, regiments all carrying identical shields just the same, marching off to war, and they're banging on drums, and they're waving banners, flapping in the wind, Shield maidens in every shield wall on both sides in every battle. Hundreds of them, they're all over the place. Yeah, so now that's a ridiculous exaggeration of actual historical facts, you see. The term shield maiden is actually, well, it's hardly ever mentioned in the sagas. Actually, I think it's only mentioned once, if memory serves me right. And there are many mentions of women taking up arms and fighting. Oh, there's plenty of those. Now, usually in time of some great need, their relatives in danger or some other family issue, well, such as when Gudrun picks up a sword and she joins her brothers Hogni and Gunnar in battle. Or when Skadi's father is killed and she puts on armour and she carries weapons to seek vengeance. And, the important point, it is her armour. Yes, so she doesn't borrow it from some man. I say, Olaf, can I have an end of your weapons and armour? Have a spot of killing to do. Oh, ta, very much, thank you. No, she is already armed, you see, not something borrowed. Or when Oslug dons armour and leads an army against Sweden. There were female warriors in the army of Rus, to be sure, those Vikings who settled in what is now Russia and Belarus, and that is confirmed by Byzantine historians. And we know from the writings of Saxo Grammaticus that at one time in Denmark there were a group of women who trained as warriors, and trained very well, too, from what he says. He wrote, and I quote, "There were once women in Denmark who dressed themselves to look like men, and spent almost every minute cultivating soldier skills. They courted military expertise so earnestly that anyone would have guessed that they had unsexed themselves. Those especially who had forceful personalities, who who were tall and elegant tended to embark on this way of life. They put toughness before allure. They aimed at conflicts instead of kisses, and desired not the couch, but the kill. And those they could have appeased with looks, they attacked with lancets. Yes, Saxo didn't approve of women fighting. Oh, God, not one little bit. No, he said they should stick to female pursuits, cooking, weaving, popping out babies, that sort of thing. So he would hardly give them such credit as warriors if they never were, which lends historical credence to his story. Well, one hardly lavishes praise on something one heartily disapproves of, does one? That would not really seem very sensible. But apart from them, women would generally have fought as individuals or small groups in certain circumstances. Such as if a village was attacked, most of the men were away, or the men were being hard-pressed, and women would have grabbed weapons and joined in. But women mentioned in the sagas as fighting, joining in a battle when the need arose, show that the concept of women doing so was accepted. The concept. Since other characters never seem surprised by it, nor do they try to stop them. The aspect of concept, the fact that if something was impossible, never happened, couldn't happen, they wouldn't mention it so often, would they? That's frequently overlooked, you see. Yes, mythological subjects might be pure fiction, flying horses or dragons, but not everyday matters of normal life being treated as quite acceptable. And, some 30 graves have been found of women buried with weapons, many of them military weapons like swords, shields, and war axes, The sort of thing that would hardly be used for hunting, or domestic purposes. I mean, going hunting a wild boar with a sword and shield would have been a suicide mission. Likewise, a battle axe, it wouldn't get you a deer, would it? And those women must have had some combat role to be buried with military weapons. Now, I saw one comment regarding the famous and obvious female warrior grave at Birka, a woman buried with a sword, an axe, combat knife, a shield, and armor-piercing arrows. Yes, armor-piercing arrows. Funny that. If she was just going hunting with them. I don't know of any animals native to Scandinavia that go around in armor. Do you? If you do, let me know in the comments below. But the comment about her was, well, they were clearly a man's weapons. Yes, obviously a great warrior, you see. Yes, well, he died, so, they buried his weapons with her as a tribute to him, you see. Female warrior, indeed. Rubbish, total rubbish. Yes. Well, if he went off and got that one-way trip to Valhalla with a Valkyrie somewhere, but why hadn't he taken his weapons with him? No Norseman would go off and leave all his weapons behind. And why would it be a tribute to him to bury him with her? To see how naff that idea is, just reverse it. Let's say that, she was a famous dressmaker. Oh, yes, her fashions were the talk of all Scandinavia. So when her husband, the mighty macho warrior, of course, when he died, they buried him with a roll of cloth and a sewing kit as a tribute to her. Yeah, I think you could see that's a bit unlikely, yes. But getting back to concept. In the case of Ragnar Lothbrok's wife, Osbruk, for example, her sons make no attempt to stop her. They take part of the army by sea while she brings the rest by land to attack Sweden. They don't say, oh, go home, mother, it's embarrassing. You leading our men? What will our enemies say? Our warriors following a woman, hiding behind her skirts? Oh, please, don't embarrass us. No. While on this subject, I'll deal with another misconception also created by the Vikings TV show. Ragnar Lothbrok was never married to Lagertha. No, his first wife was Thora. Then he married Osbruk. Nor was Ragnar actually a real person, as far as we can establish. He didn't really exist, so, he wasn't very likely probably to have married anybody, really. But he was seemingly a composite figure made up from several genuine men who existed over a considerable number of years. Oddly enough, those said to be his sons were real enough. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and Uber. But from a biological point of view, it seems very, very unlikely that they actually have been produced by a man who didn't exist. I mean, I think, biology is pretty strict on that one. But, their parental claims were probably simply cashing in on a legend of their own times. No, yes, we're sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. No, don't mess with us, Ducky. We're sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, yes, and don't you forget it. Another very common misconception is the Vikings' supposed all-embracing hatred of Christianity. Oh, of course, some Norse pagans would have disliked it, just as members of every faith have disliked other faiths all through history. And Christian attitudes to them, especially trying to convert them or, kill them if they didn't convert. Well, obviously that wouldn't help in that regard. But the Vikings had some unique, special detestation of Christians simply for being Christians. Well, that isn't true at all, you see. A few might have, I suppose. Religious bigots are found in every culture, but the majority wouldn't have been particularly concerned about it. Their considerable intermarriage with the Christian Irish and the numbers who converted to the new faith here in Ireland and other countries they settled in as a result. Well, it's clear enough evidence of that, you see, that they had no problem with Christianity. And, of course, pagans as a group, they never sent out missionaries to convert other people. They didn't try to convert others. They didn't care what other people believed in, nor did they burn people at the stake for not believing in their gods, as the Christian church was rather prone to do. I saw it very well put by someone who said that the Norse were generally very tolerant of other people's gods, but if you tried to make them worship those gods by force, well, you'd find an axe 5 inches inside your head. Rather well put, I think. I'm probably quite accurate. But, you ask, didn't the Vikings raid churches and monasteries, destroy nunneries, make a beeline for Christian religious sites and destroy them with savagery? Yes, they did. But you see, just as a burglar today raids wealthy houses in rich districts where the most valuable things are to be found, rather than really wasting their time with poverty-stricken ones in run-down slums with dirty curtains on the windows and very little worth taking inside. Most of the wealth was in the hands of the church in those times, you see. Many bishops were financially far better off than the kings they served. Churches and monasteries were filled with gold and silver, precious jewels, offerings of money from the faithful, to buy a better seat in heaven afterwards. So that is where Viking raiders would go. I mean, at the church of the day, the wealth of the day, I should say, but in the hands of Muslims and Jews. Well, the Vikings would have ignored Christian establishments. They'd have walked right past the Christian church and they would have attacked mosques and synagogues. And today, we would be told, with equal misconception, of course, that they hated Islam and Judaism and they wanted to wipe those two faiths from the face of the earth. Yes, that is worth thinking about. Part of the Viking bad image with Christianity, of course, stemmed from the fact that early accounts of them were written by, yes, monks and priests, usually the only people able to read and write in those times, as well as being among their most frequent targets. So, of course, they naturally tended to highlight the brutality of the Vikings, who were, of course, pagans. Yes, they were pagans, and thus, in the eyes of the church, servants of Satan to begin with, who were totally vile and evil as a result, incapable of doing anything other than pure badness, simply for the enjoyment of being bad. Yes. Well, nor, of course, were those townspeople who had their homes burned, their women taken as captives, and everything of value stolen, very likely to have much interest in the culture of the people who had done it. I mean, they wouldn't have cared if the Norse sniffed flowers and wrote love poetry. Dead bodies and burned buildings were the only things they saw, or indeed cared about. It's understandable enough, I suppose, but it led to a distorted and misinformed view of the Norse people that will linger right down to the present day. Brutality, barbarism, rape, plunder, pillage, etc., Now, what would you guess if sheep were asked to write an account of a wolf pack? Would you get a fair, understanding, balanced account, taking into consideration the food requirements of the pack, the laws of survival as nature intended, and so on? I think as John Wayne might have put it, "The hell you would, Pilgrim." Continuing with the misconceptions about them. The Norse are frequently seen as, well, scruffy, unkept barbarians who probably smelled a bit in a hot day, with matted hair and primitive personal habits. Their culture, a backward and unenlightened one, were very well suited to the so-called Dark Ages. Well, again, that is a misconception, you see. The Norse were probably the cleanest people of Europe in the early Middle Ages, combing their hair and washing their hands and faces every day and bathing once a week. Yes, the day that we know as Saturday being known as Lolgaldr, which means the pool or bath day. Norse cleanliness astonished the Anglo-Saxons, who were mystified by such strange and unnatural things. There's even one Saxon account of them wanting to kill the Norsemen because they were so clean and well-groomed that Saxon women were becoming attracted to them. Yes, and the Saxons feared losing their women to the Northmen, which says a lot about the personal state of the Anglo-Saxons, I'm sure. And we have it on the authority of an English monk and chronicler named John of Wallingford, who was writing in 1002 AD, just after the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre, when King Ethelred the Unready rather foolishly ordered an attack on Danes living quite peacefully in his kingdom, thus bringing a rather considerable retaliation down on himself. But some of the Anglo-Saxons were quite happy to kill the local Norsemen. Not just because the king thought it was a very good idea, because they didn't really like the king very much anyway, but because of the far greater Norse cleanliness. Yes, Saxon women were actually going off with them in preference to their own men. No, they didn't like that very much. John of Wallingford wrote about the Norsemen, and I quote, "caused much trouble to the natives of the land, for they were wont, after the fashion of their country, to comb their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, to change their garments often, and to set off their persons by many frivolous devices. In this manner they laid siege to the virtue of the married woman, and persuaded the daughters even of the nobles to be their concubines." Yes. Well, now, while it isn't true to say everyone in the Middle Ages was dirty and unkept, which is also quite a popular belief. No, that idea was put around in the 18th and 19th centuries to make modern people seem so much more civilized, you see, than those nasty people years ago. The Norse did develop the idea of, well, daily cleanliness more than many other people of their time, and that is certainly a fact. And the Norse had more advanced social attitudes than many others at the time, and women in particular enjoying a freedom far greater than women in many other lands, despite living in a male-dominated society, which of course the old Norse society was. They had rights to own property, to inherit, to control all aspects of the home, divorce their husbands more easily than was the case in many other lands, especially if a man hit his wife. Oh, you weren't allowed to do that. I mean, she didn't gut you herself, well, one of her relatives probably would. And, of course, the women were not stigmatized during their menstrual period or after childbirth, as women often were elsewhere, where they were shut away as unclean, yes, unclean. Nor were disputes always settled with an axe or a sword, with violence, as is popularly believed. I mean, many disputes were settled peacefully at the Thing, a gathering where people would discuss issues and problems and obtain judgments, which anyone could attend and be heard. Of course, disputes could involve violence, yes. Well, that was understandable, I suppose, when so many people were armed, even if only with a knife. I mean, most women would have carried a knife as well as the men. But like many other things, I suppose, violence gets more attention than non-violence as far as history goes. So, Eric bashing Olaf's head in with an axe because Olaf cheated on him it's much more interesting than if the law speaker at the Thing had simply ordered Olaf to pay compensation. That would make a pretty dull saga, telling it around the campfire, wouldn't it? But brains spattered all over the place. Oh, that would make a gripping tale around the hearth on a winter night, wouldn't it? It'd be much better on TV, too, all the splashy blood stuff, Yes, I can see where this concentration on the violence comes from. It's much better television. How should we see the Vikings today? I mean, should we see them as raiders? Well, last, of course, because they raided, you see, yes, but they didn't do it every day of every month of every year. Many of them never did it at all. They took time off to farm and grow crops, to make things, to have consensual sex. Yes, consensual sex with women they hadn't abducted from somewhere else, but were actually married to. They raised families, built towns, told sagas to pass the time, carved runes on things. And, they buried their dead in often spectacular ways, such as entire ships containing the dead man or woman, and covering them with great big mounds of earth and stones. Most of the so-called raiders, they would have been farmers, fishermen, carpenters, workers of various kinds when they weren't raiding. Their raiding was generally a part-time occupation. It was something they did in their spare time when they weren't doing something else. The numbers who earned their entire livelihood from plunder, they would have been quite small. They spread new ideas to distant lands, and they brought back similar things to their own land, in an age when, most people knew little about what lay beyond their own town or village, nothing at all often about other countries, even that they existed. Often what was over the next hill would be quite unknown to people living in a village. The North was so much more than raiders, with ships with dragon heads on the prow, you see. They had a complex and well-devised social structure, a legal system, what we might today call family values. They regarded honor and bravery as important. They were more accepting and tolerant of others than were many people of those days, or even since. That they were no more violent than most people of their time. They simply used violence in a better and more effective way. All things that deserve our respect. We have to see them in the context of the age in which they lived. It was a very different world than what we know today, and allowances have to be made for that. We can't judge some things about them by our standards, though in truth much of their society stands up very well to scrutiny by our present-day standards. There are sadly still parts of the world in the 21st century that have lower standards of morals and ethics than did the Vikings over 1,000 years ago, who are not as tolerant and frequently just as brutal, sometimes even more so, and treat women especially in a degrading and humiliating manner unknown to the Norse. I think that's pretty obvious when you just watch the average news broadcast these days. So that brings us to the end of this attempt to set the record straight on the popular and often woefully wide of the mark image of the Vikings as such, and aspects of Norse mythology and culture. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly found it very interesting to do, and hopefully maybe, change a few ideas. If you have researched the subject, you know a lot about it, well then most of what it's head's probably old hat, and you say, no, what's he saying all that for? We've heard that before, But if your knowledge of the Vikings came purely from TV shows, well, hopefully I've been able to educate you a little bit, which is always very nice to do. Anyway, for the time being, I shall say farewell, goodbye for now.